Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so hi, I'm Simone Aspis, a disabled woman, and I often describe myself as somebody who's labelled by the standard IQ test as having learning difficulties. I think this is really important because I'm somebody who has a invisible impairment, and because I don't have a learning difficulty that where people could assume that I am disabled by society. It does present particular challenges, particularly in my early time in campaigning, in getting your voice heard, but not only getting your voice heard, but actually being seen as a real disabled person who's got something to say and something to contribute towards the campaigning for disabled people's rights. And also, who are you as somebody to speak on behalf of disabled people, particularly those with learning difficulties? So I hopefully I'll come with a particular perspective on that from somebody who has a hidden impairment. And because the learning difficulty label is so large in terms of variation of how people experience the barriers, often a lot of assumptions are made about what you can, what you can't do. People don't ask about what you can, what you can't do, what support you need in order to participate in everyday activities that we all take for granted. So anyway, I'm one of those people, from the day I was born, I was kicking arse. I really did have some confidence. At the age of 3, I remember my parents were taking me to physiotherapy and being told how to eat a yogurt in front of a mirror because I had physical difficulties that comes with dyslexia. And I remember running out of the room I was thinking it, but I couldn't speak it at that time, thinking, why did my parents need this support to do this? Why am I in this room, in a separate room from everybody else in terms of learning how to do everyday tasks? Well, actually, that should have been done in my home. I just remembered a lot of the time was, my body was being stretched and manipulated, but had no understanding of the reason why. But I did feel, for me, that I felt very uncomfortable. But that was the beginning of getting my voice heard. As a consequence of that, I went to various special schools, and didn't I say it, I was still speaking up about my rights. At the age of 10, an ex-pupil said to me, "Oh, I remember you, Simone, you were talking about poor images of children with learning difficulties in the media." What? At the age of 10? At the age of 12, 13, we had a little label on the train that would go from London back to our school that said this coach is reserved for mentally handicapped children. And what do you think I did? I tore the bloody thing down. Okay. But interestingly, whilst I felt I had a voice, I felt like nobody was hearing my voice. It was being interpreted as being difficult behaviour. I needed my behaviour managed by other people. I was a moaning Minnie, lost a penny. So therefore, it was always being seen as a negative thing to speak up. And within my family context, I had the similar issue there. Where there was an issue around. I come from a Jewish traditional family, and Jewish boys are always valued more than Jewish girls, and particularly if they're non-disabled, and I was. So, a lot of my brother got a lot of the resources. He went to a public school. He had opportunities, but I didn't have. He had more pocket money than me. And it was me saying, why? But because I wasn't getting any responses, I just kept persistent. Because I remember one 13-year-old social worker that said to me, "Simone, really good social worker, who said, Simone, you've got to keep going with this because you will make it. You will stand up for people's rights." And it was just one person that really gave me that confidence, whereas I still wasn't whilst I still was in environments where nobody would listen to me, people wanted to devalue my voice simply because I was disabled, because I went to a special school. And it was through that I just kept maintaining, I know I have a voice. I know I have a voice. But it was a question of where was I going to share this voice? I wanted to join a women's movement at the age of 13, 14. I was into animal rights, but as you imagine, being in a special school in the middle of nowhere, and there was no internet those days, there really wasn't much of an opportunity to really have, to be able to nurture that voice and really get a sense of that voice. But it was still there. It was still there. So, when did it really begin? When did I really begin to really feel I had a voice? Well, I was at the BBC. I was working for a disabled programmes unit. Some of you may or may not know. It was called From the Edge. We did lots of various programmes. We filmed lots of campaigns around disabled people's rights. And I thought, you know what? I don't want to be behind this camera watching everyone taking part, doing this campaign. I thought, you know what? I want to get stuck in and do it. Because I identified as having a learning difficulty at that time, and what I should have said was I was actually involved in the Special Olympics movement, where I was helping a young lad with learning difficulties become professionally sponsored for the Special Olympics in my former life, I should say. But what was really interesting was the father said to me, Gary's father said to me, Simone, you've got to go out and you've got to speak up and tell people why special schools are the worst things possible. It's only through speaking up that other people will hear what it's really like being in a special school and the barriers that you face, and give people the opportunity to change. I thought, yeah, I've heard that one before, haven't I? Given that I've had a really long time. So I keep holding on, keep looking for those things. Anyway, so my moment came, two things at a similar time. I had an article published in the Jewish Chronicle. It was a BTEC national, I got a BTEC national diploma, and I was nominated to go and see the Duke of Edinburgh to receive my diploma. What a wonderful achievement for a young lass with learning difficulties, comes top of a class and gets a BTEC national diploma. Clap, clap, clap. And the JC wrote this really patronising article about me. And I thought, things have got to change. Well, the first thing that happened was I got involved in block telephone. That was my first thing. And I'm sure Sophie and you, Penny, were probably involved in that at that time, because I was really interested in challenging the whole charitable image of disabled people. And at the same time, I was beginning to get myself involved in People First, which is an organisation run by people with learning difficulties. And I just thought, naivety, all that's really needed to do was people with learning difficulties just needed somebody to come in and help and kind of and help them get involved in sort of campaigning around the civil rights legislation, because at that time the campaign was very much dominated by disabled people with physical and sensory impairments. It was like, where were my rights? Where were my rights? And it was at that time where I picked up that fabulous thing called the social model disability. Wow! Barriers faced by me were nothing to my impairment. For a lot of time, I blamed myself for a lot of the issues, because that was what was coming from the environment. So my voice came through understanding the social model disability, understanding however poor it was written, it was written around people with learning difficulties. I got the idea simply, organisational, social, environmental barriers. Right, that's all about civil rights, isn't it? Yeah. And therefore, that's where my voice began to happen. So I got involved with People First. I was the campaigns coordinator, and there were a lot of challenges there, because at that time there was a hierarchical sense of what around learning difficulty. Do you really have the same learning difficulties as other people with learning difficulties? Because other people with learning difficulties in People First had more deemed global learning difficulties, whereas mine was more related to dyslexia. I thought, I don't get that. I had the same barriers. I was treated as though I had a learning difficulty. Nobody, it was like, you have a learning difficulty. Everybody was treated the same, whether you had a global learning difficulty or not. Was always my experience. Always my experience. And people, I've had people, who've said to me, help, do you want me to help you cross the road? No, I don't need somebody to help me cross the road. Some people do, and that's fine. I don't want to undermine that. But it was that assumption that people didn't ask before they just kind of grabbed your hand. So therefore, I kind of understood, and because I went to a special school, like other children with learning difficulties, I faced the same barriers of not, being able to participate, having less opportunities for non-disabled people in participating. But there were challenges there, and the challenges were, and I think, to get my voice heard there were challenges there in terms of, were you really a disabled person? Who are you? And I came in, and I came in probably a little naivety. Maybe I should have done. I realised there was a lot of work that needed to be done. And I think what I learned from that experience was a lot of people learned difficulty, saw politics out there, and they saw, civil rights legislation somewhere else. There was no putting the two together, right? And what I was able to do was do a lot of grassroots work in terms of going to speaking up groups and actually get people to understand that actually, you need to have civil rights, in order to have the opportunities that non-disabled people take for granted. So therefore, one of the things I learned from that experience was how important when we are speaking, finding our voice, is in terms of supporting people. But understanding voice is about making those connections between society, between the barrier society comes to the legislation and the individual. Because it's so easy if all you've been told all your life, like I've been, you're the problem, you need to be fixed, and nobody gives you the tools to understand. If you remove these barriers, then you're able to participate. And what you find, and what I found was through that, your voice becomes stronger, because what your understanding is actually, whilst you can recognise that sometimes, that our impairment does cause us some barriers, and we do have some feelings, and there are some limitations to to how we experience our life. But we also have the opportunity, where there are barriers to be removed, to also advocate for that. So it gives you a much more holistic way of looking at your experience as a disabled person. And one of the meetings I went to so in terms of actually talking to MPs themselves, it was, I found it was actually very, people were very receptive to that. And I think that was probably because disabled people with other parents laid the ground. So going around, and I think what I've also learned from that isn't just kind of isn't just about your promoting your voice in terms of what about speaking, but it's also about doing. I think what we sometimes reflect is, but sometimes what we forget is actually there is, when we are talking, when we are doing, we're also speaking, and I call it speaking through action, and therefore through doing direct action. So whilst I was working at People First, whilst I was working for a Disabled People Action Network, on various other campaigns around the civil rights legislation, and the community care legislation, and the disabled people's freedom drive around people in institutions. That actions also can often speak louder than words as well, and participating in actions. And one of the things that I found was liberating was that whole idea that actually you can get involved in things, and you can speak up both individually and collectively if you are involved in actions themselves. Anyway, going on to in terms of getting more involved in kind of more political scenes, where you're actually starting to play some political games. How do you get your voice heard when there are political agendas? So I've stood as a Green Party, and I was the disabled rights spokesperson for the Green Party, and I stood at the GLA elections, and I also stood as a prospective parliamentary candidate for the Green Party. At that time, the Green Party were debating the social model disability, so I was invited to get involved in that. But as you can imagine, it was, there was quite a lot of debate, and still is quite a lot of debate in the Green Party about whether, about the social model disability and how that applies to their policies. So initially I got involved in being asked to speak about this, which is what I did, and that what inspired me to get involved in the Green Party machinery, as they say. So for the GLA campaign, that was going back 15, 20 years, well, I think it was for the first time, I knew that everybody was going to speak about environmental issues, because that's exactly what the Green Party stands for. It's about environmental issues. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go for something very different, because part of the GLA list is that there's 10 people, and what you hope to have is a diverse range of people with diverse range of ideas, right? In order, what you want, you want to appeal to the electorates, being, that the Green Party doesn't just deal with environmental issues; it does deal with human and civil rights legislation, deals with people's rights. And I thought that's the ticket I was going to go down on. And so I put myself forward. I did the usual kind of canvassing, but I didn't. I said, look, I'm not going to come on the environmental ticket, because that isn't really my area of expertise or my area of passion. Whereas I do expect the Green Party, that's what they do. And therefore, I decided to go down the disabled people's rights agenda. And therefore, having a different voice was also helpful. So actually recognising you have a unique voice, but a voice that complements a much bigger voice in terms of a political agenda. So I went down that line, and I canvassed like I normally did, and I was surprised to find myself as number 6 or 7 out of 10 people on that list. So I was put forward as being part of the GLA list, as being on the same list. A couple of years later, I was still involved in the Green Party. I had a big issue around the social care agenda. The Green Party decided to have a social care agenda, and it was very paper. They sent it to me as a disability spokesperson, and said, would I endorse it? I said, no, not over my dead body I was going to endorse it, because you know what, it was all about institutionalisation, it was all about people with learning difficulties being put into residential care, and they didn't even recognise the independent living, the Disabled People's Independent Living Fund, they didn't recognise the Disabled People's Independent Living. So I was accused of God knows what, how dare I split the Green Party up, etc. So I said, okay, let's try and run some workshops, and let's try and get this issue on the agenda. And let's see who my allies are, because I think that's really important when we're finding our voice. We also establish that we're not always alone, and that there must be some allies out there who can come and join in the debate and understand with us. So through that exercise, I managed to find a number of disabled people hiding away in the Green Party that were prepared to come out and say, yeah, I'll support you, I do get the Independent Living Fund, and I do support independent living. So I went to a number of I ran a number of workshops, and often I find face-to-face meetings are always really important. Finding a voice is about building relationships with people. Often it's about through face-to-face relationships alongside Facebook. That's obviously now used. I mean, at that time, I think there was a lot of debate going on online, and I don't often think that's the best way of getting your voice heard. Is get your voice heard. And I thereafter decided, and then after a number of sessions, and that working through what this actually might mean in terms of the Green Party, recognising that, look, if you are going to support the social model disability and you support disabled people's rights, then you have really not much choice, really, support disabled, to rewrite the whole of the social care policy that reflects disabled people's rights to independent living. So I went up to conference next time, and I said, as a disability spokesperson, if this doesn't go through in terms of endorsing the social model, I have to resign, because there's no longer that I can sustain my place as a Green Party disability spokesperson if I don't believe it's going to promote disabled people's rights. So I think one of the things that I look from that really is the importance of the integrity of your voice. The fact that you shouldn't be compromised just because there's an organisation, because someone else has taken a very different line, and usually a line that isn't defined by disabled people themselves. So the good news was that social care policy did go through for everybody other than people who have mental health issues. We had to, there was a little compromise on that in terms of that the Green Party felt they needed a little bit more time to revise the mental health section. So I thought, okay, that's fine. Given that we've already started, that would go next time round. So, I think the other important thing around that is around ideas. I think the important about having a voice is about, sometimes when you have a voice, you're often having to promote unpopular ideas. Ideas that go against the grain. And my experience of that has been when I was working at the Integration Alliance and the Alliance for Inclusive Education, where I strongly believed that we could never talk about inclusive education unless we talked about the qualification system, based on the notion that some people's brains are worth more than others, based on the idea that if you get qualifications and grades, you're cleverer than other people. And that had to be challenged, particularly if we're going to be talking about children and young people around inclusion. So, what did I do there? So, getting my voice heard there was another challenge. This one was really about, I think, the dominance of men and parents who had really, parents of disabled children who really were bowing down to what a lot of disabled people were saying. So at that time, inclusive education was being, the inclusive education movement was campaigning on the fact that inclusion was beneficial because disabled children could do examinations. And at that time, I had to challenge a lot of those myths, because actually there will be some children that may never be able to get qualifications. However, they still can benefit from inclusive education. So at that point, what we really had to do was look at how do we get that message across? What are the different ways of getting that message across? So for that effect, in terms of getting my voice heard, I obviously brought up lots of stories about how young people were included in mainstream education. I said to some families, why don't we come and visit schools that are doing that work without necessarily the focus on qualifications, and having to keep on challenging the policy at that time, that was pushing forward what I felt was a very mainstream policy that was favouring government policy. There was a lot of challenges, but I kept very stiff about that. I wrote a policy paper. I kind of outlined very clearly, where these ideas were coming from. They were coming from eugenics principles. They were coming from IQ tests. So spelling out exactly where they were coming from and doing a number of talks that were relating to those issues. So whilst I wasn't successful first time round, however, I was starting to build up those relationships with people that could at least see what I was doing. It did leave for a number of years having to do my own work, but at the same time I was doing my own work, I was doing SEN tribunal work, so I was supporting young people and families who are challenging local authorities' decisions around SEN work. And then I started to build those relationships with parents and I started to say to parents for inclusion now, look, why don't you get involved in some of the tribunal work? We do need your voice here alongside that. So the idea was to combine that voice. And as a result of that, there was an issue around, there was a split within the organisation that allowed opportunities for new voices to come in there. So I asked for a number of people to get involved in the Integration Alliance and Alliance for Inclusive Education. And then through that and developing a new way of looking at inclusive education, we were able to shift the paradigm from inclusive education based on exam results and children's abilities to the rights of belonging regardless who you are and your ability. So what have I learned through my quick journey around from my experiences? I think what I've learned is, if you've got a voice, you know it. Persistence always pays off, is always my experience. There will always be a space for your voice. I believe that there is always a space for your voice. I think particularly now we've got the internet, there's more opportunities to find people to share that space and to develop the strength of that voice. I think I learned that there's lots of different ways of getting your voice heard, either through speaking like I am now, through taking part of demonstrations, through actually demonstrating by practice, through demonstrating good practice, and the importance of getting allies is really important. There's nothing better than getting that echo in that room, and you'll will find that echo. So those are the lessons I've learned, and also that having the social model disability has really empowered me to really not only have a voice, but actually say, this is my own experience. And that's really important, to have that voice, to be able to contextualise that voice, to be able to understand that that voice is that there are other people with similar voices and with similar experiences where we can join collectively for world change. Thank you very much. Yeah, and it'd be good to introduce you all as well. Yeah.
I was just wondering, were your parents, were they supportive?
I think there was support in terms of me getting involved in computers, so there was one element of it. I think the difficulty in terms of my parents was because they were pushed down the medical model route. So so in terms of my parents, first thing they did was sent me down to see a doctor, see a paediatrician, went to a nursery. So you get a sense of where things were leading from. So, and because my parents were, the only actions they really had was, in terms of supporting me, was trying to fix me. But that wasn't a criticism of my parents, that was criticism of the education system even at that time. So I think my parents did the best they could within the toolkit they had, which was the kind of a medical model of disability. I also think that that my parents grew up in an age, when I got my grandma, who always remembered talking about having naughty children in the corner of a dunce hats, for heaven's sake. That doesn't help either. So there's also an era as well. And the difficulty is, if my parents had the social model, would things change? Who knows? You'd like to think it would do. Okay.
I know you've got a question there, Kirsty. I just wanted to be mindful if anyone's not familiar yet with the social model.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I made an assumption. Okay. I thought I did slip it in. I did talk about barriers. Okay. So shall I just explain what the social model is?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Okay. So social model is that people have impairments. Okay. So people have impairments. They could be physical impairments, sensory impairments. I also like to talk about having a difference that is perceived by society as being negative. So you might have a learning difference, okay? So you might think in a different way, but you may not have a loss of a function, okay? And that the barriers are attitudinal, which is people's attitudes, organisational barriers, which are rules and legislation and policy that affects our lives, that stops us from participating. And then there's environmental barriers in terms of kind of the environment, the places, the things that, the places that stop us from being able to be fully participating in society. So, I'll give a couple of examples of that. So, for example, if you're a wheelchair user, okay, if you're going into a building, right, and there's no lift, and there's no slope, right, the problem isn't that you can't get out of your wheelchair and can walk up those stairs. The problem is the barrier, is the fact is there's no ramp, no lift, okay? For someone with a learning difficulty, for example, okay? So the problem isn't that you can't read and write, or the problem you learn at a different speed. The problem is our exam system, our testing system. That's an organisational barrier, okay? That is how we measure people's ability, through standardised tests. And the fact that if you're unable to read and write, there's lots of other ways that you can access information access information. Right.
Thank you.
Does anyone else need any more examples?
I think Kirsten had a question.
Okay, Kirsten?
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry I came in halfway through, you're rocking away. Fantastic. But a lot of us who are activists have been in this situation being the only one. We think we're the only one in an organisation that we're trying to change. It can be very isolating. And I heard you talk about networking, finding other people to make sure you weren't alone. But I was wondering what strategies you have for dealing with those negative feelings that we inevitably feel when we find exclusion and it becomes quite difficult. Because my experience has been that sometimes those get in the way of us taking action.
Yeah.
What's your strategy?
So my strategy is to find out who's going to be there. So if I go into so now, for example, when I was at work, I had to go to meetings once a month where I know I have lots of negative feelings. So my strategy there has always been to have somebody there, an ally. I bring an ally with me. And I also make sure I have somebody I can speak to afterwards. I also try and, if I can, find out who my allies are. Even in those kind of difficult situations, if I can find them, I make sure I sit next to them where I can. Okay. If I'm on my own myself, I think I always make sure I have somebody I make sure that I always have time out and someone who I can speak to during the day if needed to be the case. But I think for me, is I kind of recognise most places I go to, particularly the education field, sometimes I am on my own. So it's about recognising that sometimes instead of seeing it as being on my own, what I try and sometimes do is say, you know what? In a positive way, I'm bringing a new idea to this. And therefore, it's kind of, sometimes it can, I'm not saying it's a perfect strategy, but it sometimes brings a different mindset for me and how I perceive something. So whilst I bring a new idea that I know lots of people are not going to like, but I kind of accept when you go into those environments, but as long as you've got some backup elsewhere, and keep reminding myself, I know I can go back. And I've now got allies and friends. Does that answer you?
Yeah, thanks.
I'm just wondering, in light of obviously
Do you mind me asking your name?
Oh, it's Hazel.
Hazel, hi.
Yeah, so obviously, we just had the referendum and people voted to leave the EU.
Yeah.
And I know that some of our disability rights and things like the European Court of Human Rights are all wrapped up in our EU membership.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, as a disability activist, what do you think we should sort of be focusing on to campaign in government to retain our right to leave the EU?
Okay, very good question, because I think it's good timing, and it's actually, I think from what I'm seeing from a lot of the activism, it seems to be very much around neoliberalism or very much about capitalism. So it seems to me what I'm seeing now is much more, everything's linked to neoliberalism, everything is linked to capitalism, right? Which I understand, there are barriers there, that a lot of what happens to capitalism does create barriers for disabled people. But hang on a minute, were things so great underneath socialism for disabled people? And I think what the difficulty has happened, I think, in the last year or two, particularly since Jeremy Corbyn's come in, because I've been having these kind of conversations actually, and joining up with unions, has been now a big thing, for fighting for disabled people's rights, has been, we've become much more narrowly focused around private versus public, capitalism versus socialism, etc. And what I think we might be forgetting is, what do we need as disabled people in order for our inclusion and equality? Because simply just getting rid of capitalism will not do the job. Simply saying private versus public won't do the job. Hey, just because there's lots more money sloshing around the system doesn't mean, we're going to have a fully inclusive society unless disabled people are going to demand it. So I think what we really need to do is to bring us back to our basics, and let's not frame everything within this neoliberalism debate that seems to be going much more this way. And I will be saying this on Thursday, when we are going to be reclaiming our futures. So what should we be campaigning for in Parliament? We should be campaigning to maintain the Human Rights Act. We should be campaigning for disabled people's rights. We should continue with a campaign of independent living. So, for example, where I work at the Alliance for Inclusive Education, we're going back to basic principles. We're campaigning for, we're having to say that we are campaigning for our disabled people's rights to inclusive education based on our principles. And that is what we do. We don't get sucked into the neoliberalism versus because that simply isn't going to help us. I think in some ways we assume by just getting rid of capitalism somehow disabled people's equality and inclusion. And I think that we need to make sure more so when we are campaigning for legislation that the rights we did enjoy underneath the European legislation are enshrined in British law, more so now, because we can't rely on the Human Rights Act. We can't even rely on the UN Convention, because who knows where that might go in the future if we've got another many years of being run by a Tory government. So I think it's very much ensuring every piece of legislation we have that we don't, because in a sense we do that, as activists, we do say, well, the Human Rights Act will cater for that, but we can't any longer do that, and we've got to make sure that's reflected in the guidance, that kind of thing.
Which organisations are sort of key to representing those views to government? Like which disabled people's organisations?
Oh, good question. Okay, ROFA, Reclaiming Our Futures, which is a coalition of disabled people's kind of organisations that are working together to reflect their views of kind of across the board. Okay, I suppose it all depends what you want to do, doesn't it? If it's welfare reform, if it's kind of welfare reform benefits, that kind of thing, DPAC, Disabled Against Cuts. If it's the Alliance, if you're campaigning for inclusive education, it's the Alliance for Inclusive Education. So therefore, ROFA is kind of more of an umbrella organisation. But if you are passionate about particular issues, there are kind of organisations that are more geared up and centre on those kind of issues. But you will find
you seem to have a lot of stinging determination.
Yeah.
I wonder, how do you take care of yourself? Do you ever experience burnout? And if you do, what do you do to look after yourself in those times?
So I think I'm increasingly much getting better at, when I take care of myself, I make sure I have a range of activities that are not kind of campaigning focused. So I'm a member of the gym, which is really important. I've done life drawing. I'm not quite sure doing a PhD is taking care of yourself, but I'm desperate to get that done in order, don't get me going about getting your voice heard there. But in terms of, I also make sure, I think it's about ensuring that I have a network of friends that I can talk to, both in the movement and outside the movement. Make sure that you've got opportunities to kind of switch off. So I've got a couple of friends where I just go out Saturday night and watch a film, like everyone else does. I do keep fit. I also ensure I have a good, support network, so people I can talk to. I think that's really important, and where people come and speak to me as well. I think I think where I sometimes, and I'm getting better at this. I think particularly online, I have to remind myself when to stop and just get out of the situation, and I'm getting better at that. I'm not perfect. I'm getting better at that. And therefore, I think it's about ensuring that you sometimes just need to get out of this and find a different way of doing it in a different form.
Do you ever feel the pressure, I know a lot of us won't be able to relate to this, do you ever feel the pressure to speak for all disabled people or to speak to experiences that aren't necessarily yours? But that kind of pressure that comes with being a vocal, spokesperson.
Yeah. So in those situations, I'm very careful, but I try and I represent organisations that are not far from my beliefs and principles. You know, the nearest I get in terms of compromising on my principles is around the abortion legislation, but I can live with that, where it's women's rights versus an unborn baby's right to life, and there is a big debate about that. And I'm quite happy to live with the idea that women have the right to freedom to abortion, but let's have the idea that both disabled and non-disabled unborn babies have a equal right to life. So whilst I might have a view around abortion, but I can live with that. But where there is a line where I just won't go. So if like for example, if the Green Party adopted that social care the social care policy, I would have resigned. I mean, I would have resigned because I think it's really important, because I value my voice, and I always want to ensure it's a voice that has integrity, and therefore I speak with that. And if I'm not true to myself, then I get out of those situations. And yeah, you sometimes lose work for that, but at the end of the day, I value my voice. Does that mean? Yeah, I understand people have to make those compromises, and I'm not here to judge people according to that. So I don't want people to think, no, I'm judging people. I'm not doing that. But everybody just has to find where their comfort zone is on that one.